Hello and welcome to UnHerd Ideas. I'm Freddie Sayers. The Brexit wing of the British Conservative Party has had a globally influential few years. First, Brexit itself, then ejecting Prime Minister Theresa May for essentially being too soft, bringing in their hero Boris Johnson, and now ejecting him too. They are now flocking towards Liz Truss over Rishi Sunak in the coming leadership election. But what do they really want? Are they simply small state, low taxes, or is there something else going on? Here to try to make sense of the broader philosophy is one of their team captains and recent heroes, Lord Frost, David Frost. Welcome.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So you were a career diplomat, you became a special advisor to Boris Johnson, ultimately a peer and a minister, and the head of the UK negotiating team for a chunk of the Brexit negotiations. And then you resigned. You were one of the first. You sort of started a bit of a trend in terms of resigning from Boris Johnson's government in December 2021. I thought we'd start with that moment because Rishi Sunak, this morning or in the last 24 hours, came out with a version of that month, December 2021, which seemed to suggest that we were on the verge of lockdowns once again. And thanks to Rishi, they were averted. Is that true?
So I think that when the week when my departure leaked, because it was meant to be an agreed departure in January and then came out earlier, I think a lockdown definitely seemed to be on the cards, as far as I could tell from the discussions internally. Obviously, the decision not to lock down was taken in Cabinet a couple of days after I'd gone, so I don't know exactly what led up to it. But I think, to be honest, a number of factors were there. There was the parliamentary revolt by Steve Baker and Mark Harper and others. I think my unexpected departure was part of it, and the cabinet clearly wouldn't go along with it. So I think there was quite a lot going on. There clearly were people internally arguing against this, that's clear, but exactly how.
Well, now you're no longer in that government. Perhaps you can tell us, who were they? I mean, retrospectively, when we look at that whole COVID period, it's a really important moment to understand where people are on issues of freedom and how they react to those kind of crises. Some voices within the cabinet were really pushing for a lockdown, as I understand it, and some were pushing against. Who should we think of as the people on the right side of that argument?
So I don't want to kind of say who said what in some of these discussions, not least because I wasn't there in all of them. I think Michael Gove clearly was more kind of hawkish on lockdown. I think he subsequently said that he got this wrong, and that's correct, I think. As to the rest of it, what worried me was the fact that actually ministers didn't seem to have the hard information on which to make judgments. There wasn't the information circulating internally about trade-offs, the economy versus health. The real facts, particularly about that South African variant, the Omicron variant, when it got going. So I think most ministers felt they didn't really have the information, and I certainly felt that for a lot of the time. So that was really the core of the problem.
So, coming to the current leadership contest, which is now down to Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss, since we started with that issue, how should we evaluate them? Because Rishi, it seems to me, does have a pretty good record all along the spectrum of possibility of that cabinet, in that he was making requests for reports that showed the benefits as well as the dangers of some of these things. He brought in dissenting scientists in the previous summer of 2021. What's your take on Rishi versus Liz in terms of that period and their decisions?
So, as far as I know, you're right in what you say about Rishi, but then he was the Chancellor, and it's his job to look at the economy, and so, if you like, there was a kind of professional requirement to try and bring that into the discussion and not make it all about health. Obviously I was doing the Brexit talks at the time, so I was an observer really of this stuff. I think other ministers, didn't necessarily have the same departmental kind of way into it, and so tended to look at what others were doing and react to it. So I think the only conclusion you could draw is that I was the only person to leave over opposition to the COVID measures and Plan B. In the end, the rest of the cabinet supported them, and we're now in a different world anyway. So I don't know whether you can really infer anything from what people said 18 months ago to where they are now.
What specifically made you resign then on that? What was the
Plan B? The Plan B. I had said to myself and others that I wouldn't support vaccine passports. I thought they were a kind of un-British thing to do. And we'd always said, it had been said publicly, that we weren't going to do that. And then some point in the autumn of 2021, that changed. And it became clear we were. And then when Plan B got sort of railroaded through, I spoke against it in Cabinet and made clear the next day I felt I had to go. So that was the straw that broke the camel's back. But kind of behind that was the general feeling that we were going back into a lockdown that the evidence didn't seem that strong for, hadn't been properly thought through. And I was kind of fearful about where that would take the country. And if we could go back on a commitment about vaccine passports, then that seemed like a big problem to me.
Let's come to this contest. So you are putting your support behind Liz Truss. And in a way you represent a kind of a wing or a group within the Conservatives who are thought of as kind of Brexit from the beginning, people who really believed in it. And there's a whole other group of beliefs that they seem to sign up to. Give us the pitch. Why do you think Liz Truss, who actually voted Remain, better holds the flame for your vision than Rishi Sunak, who voted to leave?
Yeah. So I think Brexit is just, it's an extremely important thing. It's about taking back control. It's about re-establishing democracy. It's about putting us back in control of our own affairs. But in the end, it is only a door we had to go through, a kind of gateway to other things. And what is important now is taking advantage of the fact the levers are all back in our own hands again. And there's no point in saying you're in favour of Brexit if you're not willing to do the things that make Brexit succeed. In my view, what's necessary is significant reform, liberalisation, change, somewhat smaller state, lower taxation, domestic reform, while rebuilding an effective state that can do important things properly, like control the borders, law and order, that sort of thing, rebuilding the British state and the nation of the United Kingdom, which has been, I think, a bit sort of sapped away at in recent years. So to me, all those things sort of go together, and that's why, for me, Liz Truss is the candidate who best encapsulates that. She gets that we need to change. Things need to be done very, very differently to how they've been done over the last 25 years, and we need to start that now.
So why Liz more than Rishi on that? They've both been members of this government, so they're not exactly change candidates in that respect. Liz Truss is thought of as a kind of Thatcherite, small government type of Conservative, and frankly, until recently, so was Rishi. What is the distinction? Why do you fall on that side of the line?
So, they're both obviously very serious candidates, and I like to think I'm a friend of both of them, despite the current campaign. But I do think that there is a kind of fundamental choice being offered between continuity and change. And when I look at what Rishi Sunak how he started the campaign, it does seem to be on a much more sort of continuity, conservative, fiscal conservatism and responsibility pitch. Now, obviously, in principle, those are important things, but I think at the moment we're at a time where we need to support growth. We need to kickstart the economy and get ourselves moving again, get out of the immobilism and the kind of slow growth and productivity that we've got used to in recent years. And that's why I think a change of direction is most important.
So that change involves tax cuts,
yeah,
and possibly more borrowing, at least in the short term, to make that possible. That's fundamentally the dividing line, is it?
So the way I would look at it is that we're about to go through very difficult period. It's clear that it seems likely monetary policy is going to tighten further, though that's obviously for the bank. People's budgets been hit with the energy costs and so on. We need to support them through that period. So if you're going to have that sort of tightening in other areas, some sort of fiscal loosening in the interests of creating incentives and supporting people seems important. Over the medium term, obviously, it's important to get a grip on spending. Got to assume that interest rates are probably going to be a bit higher over time nowadays. We need that responsibility. We need a smaller state, and we need reform so that we get back to more normal levels of productivity again.
The bit that I'm confused about, I suppose one of the things I'm confused about, is why small state, as you put it, is the Liz Truss campaign, when, as I can see, they seem to be more in favour of bigger borrowing. So at other times in recent decades, a political party that was okay with big government borrowing would be thought of as a big state, kind of left of centre type of project. And now Rishi is being called the big state lefty because he doesn't want to borrow more. How should we square that?
So I don't think borrowing and the size of the state are the same thing. I mean, I don't think either Rishi or Liz are proponents of modern monetary theory or, the idea that borrowing doesn't matter. I don't think either of them would say that. I think what the Liz campaign is saying, given where the economy is at the moment, some leaning towards a bit of fiscal relaxation and reversing the tax increases that we brought in is the right thing to do. Now, borrowing isn't the same thing as a small state. The state is already at the highest level, the greatest size it's been for 70 years, and that is what has got to change.
So what does that mean in terms of sound money? Margaret Thatcher has been talked about a lot already in this campaign and probably will be a lot more. Both candidates are sort of positioning themselves as Thatcherites. And she talked a lot about balancing the books, about sound finances. She made references to, every housewife knows that they need to balance the books, that kind of rhetoric. And yet, what you're saying is that the new version of this group now doesn't believe that is so important anymore. So the idea of balancing the books, which Rishi Sunak seems to be emphasising, is not, as you see it, the priority.
I would say, nobody's talking about balancing the books this year. It's clear there's going to be a deficit for a few years yet, and that is true of both sides. And both sides accept that. So both sides accept there is borrowing for a period yet. The question is, what is the balance? And I think the Liz campaign would say, we think a bit more fiscal relaxation in the short run is the right thing to do given the broader state of the economy. I don't think anyone is saying in the end getting the debt down, getting a grip on the public finances is obviously important. It's a question of timing and what do you want to do with the sort of headroom and change of approach that you're creating. And I think that's where the difference is.
Do you think it is Thatcherite, though? It's fair to look back, given how much she is talked about. Do you think these are two Thatcherites? Do you consider yourself a Thatcherite? Is it even relevant to talk about that anymore?
Well, I mean, Mrs. Thatcher came in at a time when the challenges faced by the country were quite different ones. There were very significant challenges, and I think in terms of the scope of the problems we face, there's an analogy between then and now. But there were different challenges, and she came in at a time when the British state we just called in the IMF. Fiscal responsibility was something that seemed to have gone out of the window a long time before, and the focus had to be establishing credibility with markets that somebody had a grip once again. Now we're in a different position. The country, the successive governments do have fiscal credibility compared to many others around the world. The question is, what do you do with that without losing it? And I think Mrs. Thatcher also believed in growth. She believed in reform. She believed in change. She believed in boosting productivity, and those are also Thatcherite things, and that's what we need to be doing in the short run. We need to be increasing the size of the cake so we can do some of these other desirable things as well.
So do you think there is a division? It's often said that within the Brexiteers there were multiple visions of what Brexit actually meant, and there was a more liberal, small state, open kind of Brexit vision, and then there was a more protectionist or populist Brexit vision. Do you think that's true? And do you think you come from one of those traditions?
I mean, I think both of those elements were clearly, in there and in the debate afterwards. I think they're an oversimplification, first of all, of what the challenges are, because I think most Brexiteers, the most economically liberal free market Brexiteers would still say that immigration control was an important thing to achieve. Many of them would say immigration has been too high, not everybody, but many. So I think the contrast between sort of inward-looking protectionist and outward-looking globalist isn't, I think it oversimplifies. I do think that there is no choice for the country other than free market reform, change, getting taxes down, getting the state a bit smaller. All history, all experience we've got around the world shows those are the ways in which you increase prosperity and wealth. And anyone who says there's an alternative sort of fortress Britain way of achieving that is, I think, simply wrong and can be proven wrong by history and politics. That doesn't mean, I think it is also important that the British state means something, it can control things, it is effective in the things that it chooses to do, and we've got to do both of those things together for this to work, I think.
Because the alternative point of view is really that Brexit, if anything, was a rebellion away from the sort of open Thatcherite business-first way of thinking that has dominated for decades. It does feel that the Brexit vote was in some way a desire for more protection from the buffeting of the global economy, the power of big business and free movement and all of that. Do you acknowledge that that is a driving force behind that movement? And if we go back now to whether it's Liz Truss or Rishi Sunak, a much more conventional conservatism, which leaves behind those more populist notes, it's in some way a betrayal of that Brexit agenda.
So I think there's a spectrum on this, and there probably are people you could find who would say that large state social democrat type economics and very strong border controls are an important thing for the country in future. I don't agree with that. I think it's probably a minority view in the Brexit coalition. Equally, I think that the very how would one put it? The very kind of deracinated globalization that we've seen in recent years, in which there was a lot of offshoring, in which big companies seemed kind of not to care about where they operated from, and not to, only to look at costs and not to look at where they were rooted, was also a problem. And I think it's kind of moving away from that. If you're in favour of free markets, that doesn't mean you need to be in favour of every barrier disappearing and big companies being able to do what they like. So it's finding the right point on the spectrum.
Right. So on that point, then you're not strictly so much a Thatcherite, perhaps. If you believe that onshoring or talking about making things in Britain rather than being kind of at the mercy of global trade routes is more strategically important, that's not sort of ultra free marketeer.
It's not ultra free marketeer. I don't think Mrs. Thatcher was, ultra free marketeer in that sense. She did a lot to try and get different kinds of industries into this country, and I think, the experience of the last 3 or 4 years, where supply chains have gummed up and we've had COVID and so on, shows that, arguably this has gone a bit too far, and trying to source things not necessarily on your own territory, but nearby and from reliable suppliers, and having companies that are kind of committed to the well-being of where they operate, because they also rely on the public goods that come from living in an effective state. That's also important, and I think those are reasonable things for the government to talk about.
Okay, so that's one sort of slight distance from free market principles. What about this whole levelling up idea that was described as the driving mission of the government? It was definitely thought of as part of the kind of post-Brexit settlement. In other words, that instead of just allowing market forces to have free rein, which led to this concentration of wealth and power around London and abandonment of areas around the rest of the country, there would be more interference from central government in some way. And I think Sajid Javid, when he was Chancellor, talked about how decisions for where to put things and where to spend money shouldn't be based just on efficiency and market forces. There should be a bit of a plan. Do you sign up to that? Is that part of your vision of a kind of post-Brexit Britain? Is it part of Liz Truss's, do you think?
Yeah, I think so. I think levelling up, I'm not sure I really like the term, but everyone knows what we mean, is important. Having said that, every British government for the last 100 years or so has tried to achieve it, and most of them haven't succeeded. And I think there are some very deep economic forces of geography and history that pull economic activity towards southern England. That's probably been enhanced by EU membership and being part of the single market, though that's certainly not the main underlying cause of it. I think, if parts of the country are less productive, as some are, the right response is to reduce the burdens. And I would say the right way to do it is reduce tax rates, expand the free ports, have bigger areas where it's easier to kind of act and invest and get things going, rather than have very big transfers of government money from south to north, to simplify. That I think we've seen doesn't work from historical experience, and we need to do something different.
So the idea of kind of regenerating areas, because actually if you look in history at examples of where that's been successful, it does involve spending money. Sometimes the government needs to purchase land, it needs to put in infrastructure, it needs to have a very interventionist approach to getting a new area thriving again. So it can't all be about just cutting taxes or cutting red tape in that area. Do you accept that for levelling up to be a real thing, it does involve more interventionism from the centre?
Well, it depends what you mean by interventionism. I mean, if you look at the way Docklands was regenerated, actually the private sector went first, and the infrastructure came, arguably a bit slowly later. But it came when it was needed, rather than being the prerequisite to getting Docklands going again. But obviously, there's a government kind of role in supporting what happens, but you've got to get the economic activity going in the first place.
So I'm just trying to get to the bottom of this, because it feels like the central sort of ideological question around the modern Conservatives, which is, has that sort of moment of cross-dressing, whether they called it red Tory, or it was the red wall, it was this sense that there was a different kind of conservatism. We had, for example, Teesside Mayor Ben Houchen here on this show, and he was talking about the success they've had up there, which was a combination of the kind of things you're talking about. There's a sort of Freeport style area going on up there, but there's also a lot of investment. I think the government even took control of the airport in Teesside, which is not a very free market thing to do at all. That was talked about as the new kind of Toryism. Do you think that is now going to come to an end with this change of leadership?
I wouldn't say it will come to an end. I mean, I think everybody's committed still to making devolution work, and build up regional mayors and the ability of people to do things the way they want locally. But I think it is only part of the picture. Success isn't only extracting money from central government and using it to generate things. It's about becoming self-reliant, generating private sector movement somewhere to to increase things. And I think that once again, I think the difference between red wall and blue wall is an oversimplification. I don't think Conservative voters in the red wall are particularly different from voters in the blue wall. They know the importance of business. They want freedom. They want to make a success of their own lives and build things. And they want the kind of social capital that comes with being part of a successful economy and country. And I don't think there's any real difference. Let's not forget that in the 83 election, Mrs. Thatcher won, a good chunk of what's now the red wall with exactly that sort of appeal. It's not something new. If there's an outlier, maybe it's parts of London nowadays, but I don't think the blue wall and the red wall, to oversimplify, are really that different in what they want and need.
What about one other area of government expenditure, if we're talking about small state, big state kind of questions, which is defence? Most Conservatives would be keen for continued, if not increased, expenditure on defence. Would you be alongside them in that?
So I think Liz has said we need to increase defence spending to 3% over the next few years, I think by 2030. I think we are going to have to. I don't see there's any choice in that. We let things go too far after the end of the Cold War. We can now see that. Of course, the best way of doing that is increasing the size of the cake rather than having a static cake and shuffling money around. And that's why it's so important to get focus back on the increasing the productive capacity of this country and its economy. If we can do that, a lot of other problems become a lot easier. And we don't talk enough about that. That's where we need to go.
So potentially there are increases in expenditure in quite a few areas then. I mean, it's not fully a shrinking of the state. We're increasing the expenditure on defence. There's potentially still interventions to make levelling up a reality. And of course, Liz Truss is talking about borrowing more to allow tax cuts, at least in the short term. So do you think it really is a small state offer, or is that an oversimplification too?
Well, I think the government will need to do a pretty serious spending review pretty quickly after coming in. I mean, a real spending review where we try and look at things a bit more fundamentally than governments have done in the past. Defence is a core function of government. I think everyone would say that, even the most night watchman state person, and we need to fund that properly. But equally, spending is at a very high level. It's the state's the highest since Clem Attlee. It's only 20 years ago in the Tony Blair era that it was 4 or 5% GDP smaller. That's not, that is living memory. People can remember a smaller state, and most people thought the country was sort of doing okay at the time. So it doesn't seem to me an unrealistic objective to get back to a world where the state is somewhat smaller. It does some of its core functions
4 or
better.
5%?
Well, I'm not setting a target, and I'm not speaking for Liz. All I'm saying is that most people in this country can still remember a time when the state was smaller, and life seemed to go on. So I think the caricature view that a smaller state is going to mean people begging in the streets and back to Dickensian England, that is simply not the case. What we need is a state that's somewhat smaller so that taxes can be lower and enterprise and self-reliance and growth can be encouraged. That's where we need to get to.
And where does immigration fit into that formula? Because clearly when there was unlimited numbers of people coming in from Europe to do jobs at low wages, that was a deflationary pressure. And if there are fewer people coming in, that will mean wages go up. Is that a good thing? Should we be excited about the fact that wages go up and we should be hoping for immigration to come down? Or where do you think kind of modern Conservatives stand on that?
Well, wages going up is a good thing as long as it is justified by productivity and the sort of success of the companies that people work for. If you just increase wages, you just get inflation. And that's why it's so important to increase the productive capacity of the economy. And I think we are going to have to shift over the next few years. I don't think it should be done overnight because the economy's got used to large amounts of immigration. But over time, we've got to get the numbers down.
And what sort of level?
Smaller than a city of the size of Birmingham every few years, which is what has been happening. And we're therefore going to have to move to a model where capital replaces labour, where people become more productive in all kinds of companies across Britain. I mean, a bit more like continental Europe, or parts of continental Europe anyway, in some ways, where there hasn't been the same reliance on cheap labour, and they do have better productivity records than we do. And we are going to have to go down that road, I think. But it will take time. And getting there depends on getting a lot of other things right. It won't just happen. We have to get the policy environment right in the ways I've been discussing.
Because immigration was clearly a big part of the Brexit vote in 2016. People felt they were voting for less immigration. Immigration has actually gone up since that vote, and there's been a huge shift away from immigrants coming from Europe to places further afield, India, Pakistan, places like that. Do you think that is what Brexit voters were hoping for?
I don't think it was in the short run. The last couple of years have been pretty weird economically, and a lot of things have been going on. So I don't think we should look at last year as like it's always going to be like this. I think most people think it needs to decline. We should be a magnet for talent and people who want to succeed and can bring something to this country. Obviously, that's extremely important, but we've got to reduce the reliance on, essentially, unlimited supplies of relatively low-skilled labour and do things in a different way, because it is just not sustainable in a country the size of ours and the way things work here to keep doing that.
So in terms of the balance of immigrants and where they come from, do you have a view on that? Do you think it should be shifting away from Europe like it has since Brexit, or what should a responsible government think about that?
Well, I think we should be taking people who can contribute to the country. As I said, high-skilled people who want to succeed, who bring something. And I think that should be on a global basis. To the extent that we still have lower-skilled immigration, and obviously we still will for some time, albeit at lower levels. I think we should be kind of neutral about where that happens. I think there has been a bias towards Europe. And it doesn't have to be like that, and we can do things differently.
I've got to ask you about Boris Johnson. You were really one of his people. Your post-diplomatic career in politics really came to life with him at his side, both when he was a minister, but then also as Prime Minister. What do you now think of him? Do you think that he was a necessary but sort of temporary part of this revolution that you were also part of, or how should history record his part in this?
Well, Boris was central to the Brexit vote and getting Brexit done. He had very strong convictions about that and the kind of Brexit that was necessary to deliver properly on the referendum, and he never wavered about that when many others did. And I think history will judge him more kindly than a lot of people have in the last month or two. He cut through and resolved the constitutional crisis. I think, for all the fact that I ended up going over COVID, I think our record on COVID in this country is better from the freedom and the economics point of view than many others. I think one can fairly say that. And obviously, I think he got the calls on Ukraine right, and I think that is a good record for 3 years. I'm very sorry about what has happened, and I think
you also mentioned the woke crowd in Downing Street at the time of your resignation. Who were you referring to?
So I don't think I was referring to anybody in particular. I think there was there's a climate. I mean, I've said it a few times. I think the problem was the policy making apparatus, gradually seemed to drift back to the kind of the norms of the last 20 years in some areas. We weren't pushing back strongly enough against some of the things that people were uncomfortable with. And
so you thought he went soft ultimately, and that's why you had to go?
I don't think that's why he had to go. I think why he in the end had to go was he lost confidence of ministers and of Parliament, and I think the reason that happened was we seemed to be replicating kind of handling errors, and the Pincher affair was the final straw of that. And I think the major weakness of the Johnson government was the inability to get a grip on the machine and push through things that we want, to be clear about what we wanted, and to get it done.
Do you think it all went wrong when Cummings left?
Well, look, I'm an admirer of Dom. I mean, I haven't agreed with him on everything, self-evidently, but I think he brought an ability to kind of see beyond the day-to-day, set a strategy, work out where we wanted to go, and get there. And every successful government does need people like that. They don't need to do it in the way Don did it necessarily, but if you don't have that strategic grip, you eventually are kind of pushed around by the day-to-day media, the lobbies, the normal ways of doing things, and I think that's what began to happen when. So yes,
in other words, you think that was a key inflection point.
Well, I think Don was kind of, he's probably ducking out a bit during 2020, so I don't think the departure moment was the moment when it happened. I think the drift began before that, and it continued after that.
Do you think there's any chance, and does any part of you worry, that the Tories will regret this and ejecting their leader after only not even 3 years, having won this big majority, all for small acts and big acts of perceived incompetence, but no single scandal, no huge policy division? It's never really happened before, and we're now at a position where the Tories have these two new candidates who are untested, unloved, unknown by large swathes of the public. Do you think it's possible, or even likely, that they'll end up regretting it and this could be a huge electoral mistake?
Well, I think Boris's departure was inevitable, so in a way it's sort of irrelevant as a question, in the sense that Boris in the end had to go. We deal with the consequence. Look, Boris was a kind of I loved working with him. He's an amazing guy, and I've never met anybody like him, and it's obvious that his shadow as a kind of campaigner and the deliverer of Brexit will remain for quite a long time. But in the end,
it was inevitable. Sorry to interrupt, but
in the end, it was inevitable. He lost confidence of the party. He made too many mistakes in areas that troubled people, and I think unless that could change, then what happened was going to happen at some point this year. But I don't think that. I think we have to note that large numbers of Tories did not come out and vote for the Boris Johnson government in the by-elections a couple of months ago. There clearly has been a polling effect the first half of this year that's associated with Partygate scandals, perceived inability to get a grip, whatever it is there. And that is also part of the picture. What we now have to do is develop an agenda that people like, we can communicate, and takes the country in a different direction. Politics isn't just about showmanship, it isn't just about communication, it's about having a view about where you want to take the country and why, and saying how you are going to do it. And those are the things that didn't quite get done in the last year or two, and I'm confident Liz can do that.
So you really think that Liz Truss, if she's successful and becomes the new Prime Minister, when she goes to the polls in 1 or 2 years' time, could equal or improve on Boris Johnson's vote, not only in Redwall but in south of England? You think she could beat Boris Johnson as a electoral asset?
Well, majorities of 80 come along pretty rarely, and it takes exceptional circumstances, which we had in 2019, and these things don't always replicate themselves. So, but can she? Well, no. I will just say that I think more that the number of seats you win isn't the test. Can she win a convincing majority that puts that shows that people are comfortable with what has happened, hopefully after a couple of years, and can take us forward? Absolutely, we can do that.
Well, we will see, and we'll have you back on hopefully before that to discuss it more. Lord Frost, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
That was David Frost, Lord Frost, who has become something of a spokesman for the Brexit wing of the Conservative Party since he left government last Christmas. What I tried to get into there was what the philosophy of the Tory right really is. Is it just straightforward libertarianism, where the government, as much as possible, should get out of the way and leave things to market forces? Not quite. Because on fixing regional inequality, on borrowing to help the economy get moving, on defence, on immigration, even someone like David Frost seems happy to talk about more state intervention, not less. It's the topic that will no doubt dominate the Tory leadership race, and we shall see by September which shade of Thatcherite, Sunak or Truss, the Tory members end up choosing. Thanks for tuning in. This was UnHerd Ideas.